It is red. Yeah. I can clearly see it. Okay. So, hi everyone. Welcome to my presentation. It is called Gulp for Drupal theming. You can see what I did there. Ha ha ha. My name's Nick. I am here because I love to give presentations. That's what my boss told me, and so that's why I'm here. So a little about who I am before we begin. I went to Algonquin College. I took Internet Applications and Web Development there, and I also took Print Media, but we don't need to go into that. It's there. Don't worry about it. It was a wrong course to choose. I am a former government employee. I used to work for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as one of their main web developers. And I am a current Coldfront employee, where I do mostly front-end stuff, a little bit of back-end, but I really am a themer, which means I use a little bit of PHP, but a lot of HTML, Twig, JavaScript, stuff like that. I also do a little bit of training for Coldfront. I see at least one person I've trained. Just good to see. Hopefully you have succeeded and not learned anything. Yeah. So that's really that's who I am. I'm relatively new to the development community. I did a little bit of development for a few years, just HTML and CSS when I was in print media. But 2013 is when I really started to get into development with internet applications and web development, and it's just been going from there. So we're going to talk today about using Gulp 4 with your Drupal theming. And so the first thing we need to do is just talk a little bit about theming. This isn't going to get too technical. It's going to go over an overview of what Gulp is and how it works and what it can do. It's not necessarily going to be, here's exactly how to write your Gulp to make it do something. There's a lot of resources out there that already do that. So if you, at the end, if you have any questions about stuff, I can answer it. But for the most part, you just look up Gulp, and there's tons of tasks you can run with it already written for you. So what is a theme? I've taken this from one of the training courses I've written, because I think it does a pretty good job of explaining what a theme is, but also pointing out something that a lot of themers have a problem with. So a theme is a collection of files. It's all of your Sass and your Twig and your JavaScript and your YAML. It defines the presentation layer of your website, which is just the front end. It's what people see. It's responsible for the look and feel of your site. You can override templates and markup with your theme, and that's where you put all of your custom CSS, JavaScript, any other libraries you would like to use in there. But really, that's a lot of words to just say it's what your users see, and a lot of themers really just that's what they care about. So what is the purpose of a theme? When we're talking about theming a site, what we really want to do is get the information of that website across to the users in the best way possible. So whether that be using modals for logins or stuff like that, or make sure it's accessible with what Tiff said in her keynote presentation, use WCAG, ARIA, all that kind of stuff. It's required. You really should be doing that. And also you need to make your website look good. That is a big part of it. It needs to be appealing to users, or else they really just don't want to look at your site. I've been to many sites where it's just kind of when I go there, WCAG being one of them, it's kind of hard on the eyes. So looking good is also something you need to focus on. Don't get lost in just being accessible. It's very important to be accessible, but also make your site look good. So, but that's great. The main question I want to talk about is, shouldn't we apply those rules to our code too? Let's not just think about the front-end users. Other people will also have to work on your code. You should make it as accessible and good-looking to them as well. So what can you do? You can make sure your code is clean and concise. Don't write duplicate things. Make sure you use functions properly. Like if you're repeating stuff, write it out properly so it can be called again and again. Choose the standard and follow it. There's a lot of spaghetti code out there, or just like code that's a mess and garbled and you don't know what it's doing. And as you follow some standards, at least it helps, especially in CSS or Sass, when if you use something like smacks, it's going to tell you exactly the order in which to put properties, and it really cuts down on time you have to take to read someone else's code if you already know exactly the layout it's going to be in and in the order it's going to be in. And of course you want to look good while coding. So to do this, you're going to be using PHP, Twig, HTML, CSS, possibly Sass, some JavaScript, and YAML. And so what you're going to have to do is make sure your site looks good, and then make sure your site is accessible, and then you need to follow the PHP coding standards to make that work. And then also you're writing JavaScript, so follow those coding standards and make that work. Probably using CSS, use that coding standard as well. Are you using Sass? Because you should follow that coding standard, and you're also going to have to compile your code. You're going to have to make sure your CSS is browser agnostic. If you use some styles, they don't appear in Internet Explorer, or Chrome requires a specific prefix to make it work. Also, JavaScript. A lot of JavaScript, if you're using ES 2015 or above, doesn't work in Internet Explorer. It's going to break. You have to make sure that you're writing the proper ES code for whatever browser you're targeting. You should also probably minify your code. Drupal does a little of that for you, but you can optimize it if you minimize it yourself. And also you need to look good while doing it. So there you go. Now you're a expert Drupal themer. There you go. Any questions? No?
Will you
So,
sign something?
I know what you're thinking. That's too much work. And you're right. It is a lot of work. Arguably, if you're a themer, you probably need to at least know of more code languages and standards than some of your back-end devs, because there's just a lot there. So this is where Gulpjs comes in. So I took this directly from Gulp's site because it does sum up perfectly what it does. Gulp is a toolkit for automating painful or time-consuming tasks in your development workflow so you can stop messing around and build something. Which is great, because as you know, there's a ton of stuff we need to take care of as themers. And if at least some of it could be removed from our plate, it would make things a lot faster. So what is Gulp? Gulp is essentially just a JavaScript library. It uses basic JavaScript, arrays, functions, whereas other comparable task managers, something like Grunt, is more JSON arrays, kind of, which can get a little messy. I don't know if anyone here really loves JSON, but it does tend to get long. It's open source, so people can contribute to it. And it's a task runner that's built on Node.js using streams. And so node streams essentially are just readable, writable streams of files that are parsed, and you can alter them as they're parsed and spit out multiple versions of said file, all on the fly. While you're writing the file, it is loaded and altered. So think of it like a pipe, because it is. So you're going to have your source files, and you're going to parse them. And then as you're parsing them, you alter them. You can add different tasks. And then out pops your destination files. So the workflow for Gulp is pretty simple. There's lots of plugins you can use, just like any NPM package. I don't know how many people have experienced including NPM packages, but they can get quite verbose in the length of includes and dependencies. You just write functions, just like you would in any JavaScript. You define tasks, and you run your tasks. That's all there is to Gulp. You just write them, and then as soon in your command line, type it in, it runs, you're done. So specifically, we're using Gulp 4, and mostly that is because of the control we get over asynchronicity. In JavaScript, everything is typically asynchronous, which makes it really hard to control what happens when, and if you want something to wait for another task to finish before you start another one. Gulp 4 brings in basically ES 2015 stuff with promises and awaits. So you can run a task, know that it's finished, and run a different one. In Gulp 3, essentially, unless you went through a very complicated string of dependencies, all of your tasks would run at the same time, which is not very useful if you want to compile your Sass into CSS, then minify it. It would compile and try to minify at the exact same time, which doesn't work very well. There's a lot more options you can do with Gulp 4. They've cleaned up some of the syntax that you can write, which we won't really go into because it's very well documented on their GitHub site. And of course, Gulp 4 makes for better puns because Gulp 3.9.1 Drupal theming is not as good. It's Gulp 4 Drupal theming. So, like anything, there's pros and cons to using Gulp. Some pros is just it's basic JavaScript. If you know JavaScript, you can write Gulp. It's fast. It runs typically our tasks that we have at ColdFront, which do quite a few things, take about 3 seconds to complete. And they go through about 10 or 15 different processes on a single file. It's clean, again. If it's basic JavaScript, that you can be as concise as you want it to be with ES 2015, or I guess ES 2018 now, because Gulp will run with whatever standard you want to use. And there's tons of examples out there. You can look up any task you want with Gulp, and more than likely, it exists. It's written for you, and you can implement it and alter it into what you need for your workflow. Some cons. It's really not great with PHP, which is kind of a downside to using it with Drupal, since half of your theming is going to be with PHP and Twig. There are some plugins out there that claim to lint your PHP just fine, and they work, asterisks. They don't like when your PHP files are not PHP extensions, which means your .theme file won't be able to be run through the linter, making it essentially useless to Drupal theming. So if you want to lint your PHP, I would still go with just like PHP CS. Use the Drupal standard, and there you go. Went over this a little bit. Lots of packages. Gulp does require quite a few packages. If you're going to use it with Sass, let's say, you're going to need Node Sass as a package. You're going to need Gulp Sass as a package. You're probably going to need a Gulp Sass lint as a package, which also requires Sass lint as a package, and it kind of grows exponentially from there, which is one of the downsides I found with using Gulp. However, since this is mostly a dev tool, your computer is probably powerful enough to run all of its dependencies and not have them slow down. So it's not really a concern from a development standpoint. So what can Gulp do for you? So we talked a little bit about it, but it can lint code. You can use ESLint for linting JavaScript. You can use SassLint if you use Sass. There's LessLint if you use Less. And there's CSSLint if for some reason you just write CSS, which I recommend not doing because Sass is way faster. And it keeps your code to a standard. You choose your standard, you run it, it will tell you when you've not followed it. So let's say you've messed up which order you put margin and padding. You put padding over margin. It will tell you that you've put padding over margin and you should swap it. It's worth noting that while you can run Gulp to alter as you lint it, I don't recommend doing the fix option on your linter. Specifically because while you're writing your Sass, it's linting your Sass and it will write over you. It becomes a giant mess. I've tried it. It ends up breaking a lot of code. So specifically for the linting processes, just stick to the straight out. Just let it tell you what's wrong. Don't let it fix what's wrong. So here's an example of how a linter would work. You have your Sass files. You're going through the pipe. Take your linter. It lints the files. It outputs what it found, and then it outputs your Sass. So another thing you do with Sass is, as I mentioned earlier, you can alter and compile your code. If you're using Sass, you'll need to compile it, so you might as well use Gulp to do it. You can use auto prefixer and Babel to keep things sorted in your CSS and JavaScript. Essentially, what auto prefixer does is it adds browser prefixes. So I don't know if you've ever used transform, or transition rather, but you can write transition all, and the auto prefixer will just output all of that for you. You don't have to write it all. Keeping your code nice and clean for you to read, but your production files will have all of the proper prefixes. And it does ensure your functionality in all of the browsers, even though we like to forget about one of them. So here's an example of what Babel can do. So let's say you're using ES 2017 arrow notation for functions. That will absolutely not work in Internet Explorer. It won't even give you a console error to tell you what's wrong. It doesn't know how to read that. And what Babel will do is it'll read your arrow notation and spit it out as a normal anonymous function. And so again, this is how the workflow would work. You have your Sass, let's say, you're compiling it, you're adding your auto prefixer, and then it pumps out CSS. Another thing you can do is source maps. So while you're compiling stuff, let's say you're going from Sass to CSS, sometimes it's confusing when you have, well, where did this CSS class come from? Because there's like a billion notations in front of it. I don't actually know where that's found in my Sass. You can use something called source maps, and it will keep track of every change that it makes and output it as a different file. So what it will essentially do is when you're developing, it'll tell your browser, so this CSS class is found exactly here in the Sass file. And again, so you would have your Sass, you boot up your source mapper, and then as it compiles, it maps everything, pumps out your CSS and your map files for you to use. Don't put your map files on your production server. They don't need to know about all that, and it's really just stuff you are loading for no reason. You can minify your code. Again, Drupal does this for you technically. If you don't tell it that you're including a minified library, it will minify it for you if you have that option turned on. However, I find that the Drupal minifier is not as efficient as some of the plugins you can get for NPM and Gulp, because you can customize how things are minimized. And again, another pipe. We have our CSS, we run it through the minifier, we get our minified CSS files. Okay, so we can then put it all together. We can combine every task we've made into a single call. So let's say you wanted to do all of that, and normally you'd have to call like, okay, I want my gulp and my task for styling lint, and then I want my task for minifying and all that. We can actually combine it all together just by chaining them all into a series. And what that looks like, it kind of gets a little more complex, where you can have your Sass files, and in the end, after it's been linted, source mapped, compiled, and minified, you have your minified CSS and your source maps to use. And the source maps will not only keep track of where the minifier has minified things, but it will also keep track of where that minified part of your CSS is found in your original Sass files. And the biggest thing you can do with Gulp is do it all on the fly. So as you're writing your Sass, you can have it read your Sass, compile it, and then minify it. Now, I said this wasn't going to be a hugely technical presentation, so I didn't have a huge demo for this, but at the end, if there's not a whole lot of questions and people want to see it work, I can boot up what we use at ColdFront, and you can see how whenever we change any Sass file or JavaScript file, the whole thing compiles and runs on the site. And the biggest thing to know about the watch command is it'll watch what you change and only run the tasks associated to what you have changed. So let's say you're watching all of your files, like your Sass files and your CSS files and your JavaScript files and maybe Twig files. When you change a Sass file, it will only run the tasks associated to your Sass files. When you change a JavaScript file, it will only run the tasks associated to your JavaScript file. Or like we have at work, because we're especially lazy, when you change a Twig file, it will just run a Drush CR. So you can also do a lot of other things that I haven't really gone into. You can run browser sync. I don't know if any of you know what browser sync is, but essentially what it does is it opens a port on your website that displays the website but mirrors everything that happens to everyone looking at that port. So let's say you had your browser open to your site in IE and Edge and Firefox and Chrome and Safari, all on different computers. If you're looking at that browser sync spot, when one of them scrolls, they all scroll. When one of them goes to a new link, they all go to that new link. And you can hook that up with Gulp so that when you, let's say, edit your Sass files because you want to change a style, it will do all the compiling and minifying and loading all that, and then it will refresh browser sync so that all of your browsers immediately get the changes you just made. You can concatenate files together. Not so useful if you're using Sass already, because you're probably only using a single style and importing all your files through that. But let's say you had a bunch of JavaScript libraries that you wanted to keep separate because they really have nothing to do with each other. But as far as Drupal is concerned, they're all loaded on every page. So you could concatenate them all into one file and just have Drupal load that one file instead of making, like, let's say 5, 10, 15 different calls for 15 different files that loaded on every page. Another fun thing you can do is you can actually convert SVG icons automatically into font libraries for your site. So let's say you had your logo or some custom glyphicons or stuff, you could run it, and it will automatically make you the font files that you need to include, and then you can call them as classes in your styles, and your icons will just appear. And there's a lot more you can do. Right now, we're currently playing with PHP stuff, like I said. You're welcome to experiment with PHP stuff. If you get it to work properly, my contact will be at the end of this slide. Feel free to tell me about it. Yeah. So, yeah, this is a little short presentation, but we have one more section, the conclusion. So our goals for our code were to keep the code clean and concise, follow our standards, and of course we need to look good while doing it because we're themers, and that's important. Everything must look good. So keeping code clean and concise, we can use auto prefixer so we don't have to worry about browser prefixes. So we can keep that code out of our development files, reduces code significantly by like a fifth if you're using a lot of things that need browser prefixes. If you use Babel, you don't have to worry about does my JavaScript work on IE. You can just write the clean, efficient, new stuff that works properly, and Babel will take care of expanding it into stuff that will work in IE and looks ugly. Follow standards. Easy to do. ESLint, SassLint, CSSLint. You have less lint. There is a twig lint plugin that you can use as well. And like I said, there's theoretically PHP lint, but no. Yeah, and the one thing to note here is this one is really big on, while Gulp will tell you what's wrong, it still expects you to fix it. So as much as you can run a lint, it's still reliant on your developers to follow what the linter tells them to do. And look good while doing it. So, as long as you focus on your coding and let Gulp take care of the rest, you will look good while being a Drupal themer. And now you are an expert Drupal themer. This is the real questions slide. So, any questions? No? Okay. Does anyone want to see some run? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Once you see it run, you can feel free to ask questions afterwards as well. So, I will. Can everyone see that relatively okay? Sort of. I can make it a little bigger, but really shrink that down. And I'm going to do something probably shouldn't do during the presentation, but I'm going to switch to mirrored displays so I can see what you're seeing. Okay, it worked. Okay, let's say we have a new module. This is our template, so it doesn't have a whole lot of stuff to it. And we're just going to have, okay, let's say we have .card. And let's make the now I can run my gulp lint task. Oh, and it's not defined. I will just run my gulp task. There we go. So now it will tell me that it expects margin, but found background. The color blue should not be written as blue. It should be a hexadecimal. You should use variables instead of the color blue. And it expected background color, but found margin. It also, you're going to have to trust me on this because it is minified, but the change is in here. Probably right at the bottom. If we find the word blue, or let's say .card. So there you go. We can see some of my changes have been implemented into the minified file. But the biggest thing that happens with Gulp is when we do a watch task. So you'll see that it didn't run any task yet. It is waiting for me to make a change, and then it will tell me the problems that I have. Or let's say I forgot a semicolon. It will tell me you forgot a semicolon. And let's just do this guy, and we'll use a var, and we'll comment let's say that is our code. It's not going to do anything. This is poorly written. If we restart here, so if we gulp it, again it'll tell us you've put a return outside of the function. Don't do that. So let's make a function. Let's do we're going to use our arrow notation so you can see it convert stuff. Run it again. So now you can see it minimized everything. This is why you don't want it to run while you're typing if you're going to make it correct things for you, because it will not do good things. If I run that, it'll go on. Let's bring all that back down to here. And we'll show you what happens. Not break. So now you can see it ran, and it will minify things for me. There you go. So you can see how it does actually let you know when you've made mistakes, and it tells you what it can fix for you if you wanted to run a fix. It does not fix everything. There's some stuff that it can't know. Yeah, that's kind of how to run it. It's pretty easy. I'll show you an example of how we actually run and define our Gulp files. So you have all your plugins. This is where I said it's a con, because there's a lot of plugins you have to implement to get Gulp to work. We have our directories defined here, and this is basically how to create a task in Gulp. You just make a function and you return your Gulp source, and it pipes everything that you want into it and exports it when you call it. Yeah. So here is where an example of what happens when we want to alter PHP stuff. There's not a great way to run PHP anything in Gulp. So what we end up using at ColdFront is we use a thing called Gulp Run that just allows us to run command lines from Gulp. So when a template's altered, we can just run what we would normally, but automatically with Gulp. Any questions now? Yes. So, here we go. So for what we do, we have our like core tasks that we have. We'll lint something, we'll compile it, and then we'll minify it. And basically we want to make sure all three of those do not happen at the same time. We can lint at the same time as them because it doesn't really affect what you're doing, but you want to make sure that the compiling and the minifying happen one after another. So when we look at, let's say, my main task, we can describe them as a series. Now we could also do parallel, which would tell Gulp, I want all of these run just immediately. Run all three of them, don't wait for anything to finish, just go. But because we've run them in a series, it says, okay, I want to run the lint first, wait till it's done, then I want to compile it, wait till that's done, then I want to minify it. And it takes a matter of seconds to run them all. Like it's hard to like show you step by step because it's basically just boom, 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 done. Anything else? Yes. So we have a repository for our template that we use for theming, and that's where that lives right now. Yeah. If you would like a copy of it to look around, I mean, if you just talk to me after this or get in contact with me after, I'll share it with you. Anything else? No? I release you all. And it didn't break. Yeah.